lot of that suppression comes from, in essence, feeling powerless, and that comes from not knowing how things are connected together in some way, shape, or form, as I'll demonstrate as we go on. Now, take this idea then to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of experience can be interpreted. This is precisely what we're trying to do with Anissa. That once we have this body of thought and its real first principles organized and its theories and its propositions spelled out, there would not be anything that you would experience as a teacher in working with children anywhere that you could not interpret in terms of that scheme of thought. Well, I mean, we're not there yet, but we're a lot farther along than any other system we know of. Now, a little while ago, I talked with you about comparing Anissa with 22 other models. And by that, I meant they're not really models, they're more like approaches to education, like the Bank Street approach. See, what Bank Street is willing to make the assumption that if you provide opportunities for children in an open way, they will choose activities at their own developmental levels and therefore just keep them busy and they'll grow and develop and learn. It's not a bad proposition. It's just that from our point of view, it leaves too much up to chance. Or you might have a Montessori approach, which is far more ritualized. You might have Ira Gordon's approach, or Glenn Nimnick's responsive environments approach, or you might have Weichert's cognitively oriented curriculum, or you might have Breider Engelman or Don Bushell's behavior modification approach. In other words, those are approaches to education, but if you look at them, none of them has a clear philosophical base with identifiable first principles from which have been deduced a coherent body of theory that can function as a guide to practice to achieve particular objectives. And therefore, I don't think they can. We've looked at them all. And it's hard for us probably to be objective, but we're not blind, and I hope not stupid, and therefore we can compare feature for feature of the Anissa model with all the others. And the problem with the comparison is many of the features are missing in all the other models. For instance, there are no specifications in those other models. And therefore that's why we don't think you ought to call them models. Because a model ought to be characterized by specifiable attributes that would enable you to identify the model when you see it. Because if you see it has these specifications, then you know it's Anissa and not something else, you see. Very much like when you take out a patent. There's a whole section in the patent called specifications, and that's where you spell out, you specify the things that identifies your invention and makes it distinguishable from all other inventions. And if you cannot have some of those specifications which are different from other people's specifications, you can't get the patent because it means somebody else has already invented what you think you're inventing. See? All right. This process of interpretation is the most complicated issue in becoming an Anissa teacher, because we are not trained to do it, nor are we experienced in doing it, interpreting what we are doing in terms of some scheme of thought which we have studied and come to internalize. That's why the Anissa approach is not just a little book of recipes of a few things to do with children. You know, at 10:15 you take out the Cuisenaire rods, and at 11:30 you sing a little song, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon you take a field trip. Although those things might occur in an Anissa school. But the Anissa teacher is one who has internalized that scheme of thought, has a sense of its philosophy, understands the theory, and therefore can interpret every situation in terms of that theoretical frame of reference and use it as a guide to a very generative mode of practice. Now this is important because if a teacher year after year does exactly the same thing at the same time, following the same lesson plan which she put together in the previous decade, she herself will not be growing. And since we know that modeling is a powerful form of teaching, it is important for that teacher to model the process of perpetually growing and developing by being an avid learner, a competent learner herself, you see. That's why we had to go the theoretical route. Because once we were caught in that situation of accepting that huge body of empirically verifiable evidence that children learn by being in the presence of somebody modeling what it is they're trying to learn, then we knew that we had to have teachers ultimately who were competent learners and who loved learning and one of whose great passions in life is learning. And for us, that came down to mean an interest in interpreting experience freshly, perpetually over time. And that means to become something of a philosopher, and when you are a professional, to operate on the basis of theory. Very interesting. Some of you may have seen the constructive triangle, which is the summer 1975 issue of the Montessori Teaching Journal, which is, it says ANISA issue. The whole issue is on ANISA because this year they had their entire national conference, or half of their entire conference, based on a presentation of ANISA. And of course there was a lot of questions about what is the difference between Montessori and ANISA, because a lot of what ANISA says confirms much of what Montessori did, but it also says some things about what some of the Montessorians do that we wouldn't go along with necessarily. But at this meeting, J. McVicker Hunt was present. He is one of the great developmental psychologists of our time. He's now an old man with white hair in his 70s, but vigorous. He's a professor emeritus from the University of Illinois. He's still doing research with children. And Patabi Raman and Sue Thoreau and I were out there for this 4 or 5 days of their national conference, and we sort of jumped up for joy when he got before these 600 or 700 Montessorians and said, I haven't been with you for 11 years. 11 years ago was the last time I spoke to you, and I've sort of kept an eye on what you've been doing, and I have a piece of advice for you. And his advice was this: get away from ritualized recipes and seek out the general theoretical principles that may be reflected in the recipes, so that you can generate new recipes and therefore feel excited about your work, as well as providing some fresh experiences for the children. In other words, he said, you must become theoreticians. Well, we'd never heard anybody else put it quite so strongly to teachers before, but we felt that to be an enormous confirmation. And then he went on to give some experiences and some anecdotes to illustrate his point. Now, just a couple of perspectives on this business of interpretation, because it is both the task of philosophy and theorists as well as scientists. But perhaps the difference between interpretation as a task of science and a task of philosophy lies in the idea of universality and necessity, which lies with speculative philosophy. This is what Whitehead says, a necessary system of general ideas. By necessary, he means that it has to work. It is necessarily so, not just arbitrarily so. And Whitehead suggests 4 criteria to be applied to look at the quality of a system of thought. First of all, is its logicality. Does it obey those laws of logic? Does it accept the law of contradiction and the law of the excluded middle, plus all the others I didn't have a chance to go into? Number 2, is it coherent? That is to say, does everything hang together with everything else in some way? You can't have a little piece over here that denies a little piece over here. They have to be connected in some way. Third, its applicability. That means that everything you experience in the classroom can be understood in terms of something in that body of thought. Get to some concrete examples in the course of the week. And fourthly, is it adequate? Adequacy. And by adequacy, he means that there are no items of experience not capable of being interpreted by the scheme. Now, we realize that we really step out on a little bit of thin ice here in claiming the adequacy of the ENISA model. And so that statement rests for us in relative terms. If you could ever find a more adequate model, we would like to see it, because we would immediately then change our model to make it more adequate than the one you bring up, because we're not interested in staying the way we are. We're just interested in getting better and better, which is what science is about. Again, let me caution you a little bit about the problem of language. And because we're going to be using some terms in the next 4 or 5 days, which will have to be endowed with some new meanings. And your natural tendency will be to cram the word I'm saying into a previous idea that you have, which will put you out of touch with what I'm saying. And since I know that tends to have some experience with it, I'll be harping on it just a little bit, just to make sure that we're not doing that. Whitehead mentions the enormous ambiguity of language and in conveying exactly what we mean. So there's a little problem there. And that's why we're such a bugs on definition, as you will see. Jeff did recently a paper for his comprehensive exams on language development, and he cites a couple of statements there to show the terrible ambiguity. For instance, if I say the statement, "They are eating apples," what does that mean to you? Does that mean these apples are for eating? They are eating apples. Or does it mean these people over here are eating these apples? They are eating apples. Now, part of the meaning of that sentence is carried in the tonality of the voice, which is one of the things a child learns to pick up very early, because we can say, "They are eating apples," or we can say, "They are eating apples." Now, if I say, "They are eating apples," it means that they're not cooking apples. Well, I have to say they're not cooking apples in a very special way too, otherwise you'll think these people are not cooking these apples, you see. Now, the quality of the tone of voice is not possible when you're writing. That's why writing is such a bitch. It just tears the soul to pieces. You try to get yourself down on paper and say what you mean. And that's why children must be encouraged to write from the very first moment that they can begin, to get their thoughts down. Because writing means not depending on anything else but the clarity of the line of thought. And now, since in school we don't, the little essays that kids write in school are never critiqued well, because there's not enough time. So by the time they get to the university, they're illiterate. Really. Grown people are illiterate. Well, we got there, we were illiterate ourselves. We came up through that system. So it's been quite a struggle for us to sort of impose upon ourselves a system of compensatory education. And we do it by having each other read our works and question whether or not that's what we mean. Now, Jeff gives another example where tonality doesn't even help. If you say, "Visiting relatives can be fun," what does that mean? Does that mean that the relatives have come to your house? Or does that mean you've gone to visit your relatives? It's very hard to change the tonality of voice, too, to make that clear. It's just not going to be clear. Therefore, the only way to make it clear is to have it in context. And that means it has to belong to a system. And therefore, the ANISA model represents necessarily a vast, comprehensive system of thought simply by virtue of the utter necessity of making things clear. They have to appear in a context. And you have to spell out what the context is, and that's what the philosophy in large part does. Because when you hear a given statement in the ANISA model, by itself it may be ambiguous. But when you place it in the total context, then you can make the right interpretation. Hence, it is never possible for groups of people, teachers, to be trained in the ANISA model without understanding the philosophical base. You just won't be able to understand what some of the sentences mean without that context. Okay, a statement of Whitehead about that, and then we'll go on. Whitehead says, philosophy must redesign language in the same way that in the physical sciences, pre-existing appliances had to be redesigned. Formal language is required for both philosophy and science. Hence the attention which we give to the framing of definitions. Now, I want to move to the idea of first principles. The reason for having first principles is that they are the way to guarantee coherence. And coherence and logicality are two rationalistic ideals which we insisted on living up to as best we could. The reason coherence is so important is that things that are coherent make sense, and therefore they have meaning in them. But secondly, actions based on a coherent body of thought by groups of people will be extraordinarily effective because no energy is wasted by being expressed in patterns of action which go in the opposite direction. In other words, we want, if ANISA is going to be different from ordinary systems, it means that the energies of the people who belong to that system have to be expressed in patterns of behavior that accomplish the purposes of the model. If you have vast amounts of energy leaking through the cracks or going in opposite directions, then that system will not be terribly efficient. It will take longer to accomplish some things, and in fact, some energies may be just downright harmful or counterproductive. Now, Whitehead says that incoherence stems from disconnectedness or arbitrariness among first principles. Now, I would even go one step further, or maybe one step before that, and say there is no possibility of having coherence if you don't even have first principles. Now, a few weeks ago, we had a team of people from the State Department coming down to look at the certification of the School of Ed, or accreditation for the School of Ed at UMass. And they were, we just have dozens of programs. They've proliferated enormously over the last few years. And so Don and I went down to be interviewed by these people. And they were worried about a number of things. Number one, taking a definite philosophical stand seemed unusual for them because usually a school of education just presents what Piaget says and Dewey says and Hunt says and so on, you see, on down the line. And then the poor person who's taking the course can just take it or leave it. And what they usually do is leave it. In our experience, they all leave it. And then they go to teach after having left it all. And what they do is just try to follow a little bit what the supervising teacher does. But there's no connection between all that. And the research is in now. Those child development courses, all those foundation courses in educational philosophy and ed psych, did not change the behavior of the teacher one whit. All they did was accumulate credits, which got written down in the registrar's office and enabled you to become certified. The system is anti-rational. It is incoherent. So Don and I said the ENISA model is designed to represent a coherent system of education which could therefore be efficient by virtue of the fact that the energies of the people in the system would be pulling in the same direction. And this woman said, well, what makes you think the traditional systems are incoherent? And we said incoherence stems from arbitrariness or disconnectedness among first principles, or we added hastily, having no first principles. So we said to the assembled delegates, what are the first principles of education? Well, they just lost their teeth. Their mouths just dropped open. I said, think for a moment. We'll pause for 5 minutes. It seemed like half an hour. While you think of the first principles of education. Well, finally, one woman said, well, I'm not quite sure what a first principle is. Somebody offered ordering textbooks on time. You can see why they might think that's a first principle, but that's not quite what we had in mind. Though, of course, if you don't get the textbooks orders on time, it is a bit of a mess. You had to agree. I can tell you honestly, friends, I have asked dozens of professional educators, what, in your opinion, are the first principles of your profession? And I have never, not ever, met one who had an answer. Now, they can think up one after a while, but the idea had never even occurred. Now, that means that that education as a profession in our society has never organized itself on a rational basis. And without that kind of basis, it can never hope to be comprehensive on the one hand, nor can it hope to be adequate and powerful on the other. And what we are trying to do is to take care of that problem. Therefore, we had to be concerned with the identification of first principles, which could function as the philosophical premises from which could be deduced a coherent body of theory, which could be a guide to practice. In other words, it would guide the use of the energies of the people in the system so that all the energy is pulling in the same direction. And that means it'll be more effective because it's all going not at cross purposes, but in the same direction. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Herbert Spencer, who lived at the time of our own Civil War. He was writing in the 1860s, who came on this issue of first principles and in fact wanted to build philosophy into a super science. His philosophy is called synthetic philosophy, and he felt that philosophy should become a special science whose function would be to unify all other sciences. And in many ways, what he was attempting to do was not all that different from what Whitehead was attempting to do, and so on. He believed that his science, his synthetic philosophy, the science of all sciences, would be not made up of a lot of general laws, but in fact, he would find one law from which all others could be deduced in an a priori way. Say, it wouldn't have to be subject to experience. It wouldn't be contingent upon experience. And he offered a new definition of philosophy as completely unified knowledge. Now, he started with what the physicists considered to be two very well-established first principles in his day, just as a point of departure. One of these principles was the continuity of motion. It's kind of one of the first principles of physics. And the other was the indestructibility of matter. You know, if you burn this paper, you don't destroy it, you simply change the form. Part of it goes off in a gas called carbon dioxide, and part of it remains as carbon and ash. Now, it's true, we haven't found a way to grab the carbon dioxide back and unite it with the ash and the carbon and make the paper again. But the indestructibility of matter, I think, has been pretty well demonstrated. He took those two principles and said to himself, how can I unify those into one as just an exercise? And he came to the idea that matter and motion are simply different forms of energy. And you can see this is heading in an organismic direction, and it's preparing the foundations for Einstein's work.